Hello everyone and welcome to our class on the life of David. We are in lesson 11 looking at David's battles. We're going to be looking at some different verses from 2 Samuel chapter 5, chapter 8, chapter 10, and then 1 Chronicles chapters 18 through 20 as we just trace some of David's military successes as king. You see, we have established up to this point, David is now the king over all of Israel. And what we see from chapter 5 onward, and several of these different chapters, is that it describes to us the great accomplishments that David was able to achieve through the Lord for the sake of Israel. So chapter 5 opens with David becoming the king. The first 5 verses establish that story. And then what we see is, specifically in the next few chapters, the account of military successes, David's military conquest. And so you see in 2 Samuel chapter 5 verses 6 through 10 his battles against the Jebusites. David and his men rose against the Jebusites and captured Zion, may also be known as Jerusalem. This would become the capital of Israel. In fact, David would build himself a house there, down in verse 11. We see the Philistines, 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 17 through 25, and then in chapter 8 and verse 1. The Philistines sought after David after they heard that he had become the king over Israel. You see down in verse 17. It says, when the Philistines heard that they had anointed David king of Israel, all the Philistines went up to seek out David. And when David heard of it, he went down to the stronghold. So they heard he had become king, and they thought, no, let's take him. Let's go rally against him. And so David defeated them twice. Verse 19, he defeats them at a place called Baal Perazim, and then he defeats them at a place called Rephaim and Gezer. It's 21 to 25 of 2 Samuel chapter 5. And so David defeats the Philistines and took control of their chief city. We see David's conquest against Moab in 2 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 2. And he defeated the Moabites, killing some, leaving others alive to bring tribute to Israel as a money or taxation. We see his battles and victories against the Syrians, 2 Samuel chapter 8, verses 3 through 8, and in verse 13. David defeated them and the Armenians who came to help them. We read in chapter 8 and verse 5, there's about 22,000 altogether. He also killed 18,000 in what's known as the Valley of Salt. And so they too, in 2 Samuel 8 and verse 6, they became servants of David. And he took their possessions. And in verse 6, we find that they are paying tribute and tax to David as well. So what you see, as we're starting to build this along, is that David is not just winning battles over enemies. He's not just expanding the territory of Israel, but he's also starting to build the strength, both militarily and financially, this wealth that he is attributing and gathering to Israel. And so David dedicated, and this victory over the Syrians, he dedicated the tribute and the wealth offered and taken by Israel to the Lord. 2 Samuel 8, verses 9 through 12. These chapters describe his victories over the Edomites, 2 Samuel chapter 8, verses 13 to 14. So David had stationed garrisons in Edom, and again, they become the servants or the slaves to David and Israel. In 2 Samuel chapter 10, we find about David's victory over the Ammonites. David honored the kindness of the former king of Ammon by showing kindness to his son, whose name is Hanun, verses 1 and 2. But Hanun had been given a false report that David was sending messengers to spy on the land. And Hanun humiliated David's servants by shaving half of their beard. Can you imagine? You return home and you have half the beard shaven off. It was meant to be a sign of shame and humiliation. Well, realizing how David would respond to that he wouldn't be pleased by the way that Hanun had treated David's servants, the Ammonites hired the Armenians to come and to rally with them in preparation of David's response. And so David and his men came and they struck down. And as you find here down in verse 19, struck down 700 charioteers, 40,000 horsemen, and they finally made peace by offering their service to Israel. So here's yet another nation offering their money and their service to Israel. And then you find in 1 Chronicles chapter 20 how David had even defeated the Philistine giants. And so another war came later on with the Philistines. And we find in this text, 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 8, that they had more giants than just Goliath. There's a man there who had 24 fingers and toes, 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. So, big man, big all around. But they all fell by the hand of David and his servants. 1 Chronicles 20 and verse 8. Well, ask the question, as you kind of go through these different chapters, you might see the contrast that perhaps we're getting through this historical account. How do you see the difference? What difference do you see between David's reign and Saul's reign? Well, Saul, in his 40 years as king, made very little headway in terms of the territorial gains for Israel. Even though he did have some wins, some victories, and some battles, he defeated the Ammonites in 1 Samuel 12 and the Philistines in 1 Samuel 14. Saul lacked courage. He wasn't a very courageous leader, and the fear that he had was spreading to all the people. You see that in 1 Samuel 13 and verse 7, that whatever Saul was feeling, that it reflected itself upon the people. But you contrast that with David. Here comes David, and he's defeating the enemies. He's bringing peace. He establishes a tax system, a tribal system. He is increasing their wealth. He's expanding the nation's borders. You just see a complete difference between what they are doing in their reigns, what they're bringing to Israel. And obviously, it all goes back to the heart of these two men. David was full of courage. David was a courageous leader. And the reason he was courageous goes all the way back to that 1 Samuel 17, that conflict with Goliath. David has known since then that the battle belongs to the Lord. And so if you trace it through these verses, let me give you a few just to look at here. For 2 Samuel 5 and verse 19, David inquired of the Lord. 2 Samuel 5:23, David inquired of the Lord. 2 Samuel 5:25, David did so just as the Lord commanded him. 2 Samuel 10 and verse 12, may the Lord do what is right in his sight. Over and over and over again, David and his men keep their eyes focused on God. And that they keep their gaze, their focus on the Lord, on his will, on his plan, and on his victory. And because of it, 2 Samuel 7 verse 1 tells us that God has given David peace or rest on every side. God has given him victory. And in 2 Samuel 5 and verse 12, verse reads that David realized the Lord had established him as king over all Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. God has established him as king and has exalted his kingdom. And so, because David had his eyes focused on the Lord, because he stepped out into battle with courage, trusting in the Lord, 2 Samuel 5 and verse 1, behold, it says, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, behold, we are your bone and your flesh. They trusted in him. They trusted in David. Well, at the end of chapter 8, one thing we find from David is his organizational skills. He appoints key individuals to levels of management or leadership within the kingdom. You see the wisdom of David within this. I want to point out a few. I want you to notice David's cabinet, the people that he placed in these levels of positions of leadership. You see Joab, who is over the army, the chief commander. And so when David captures Jerusalem, he offered the position of general over all the armies to whoever would strike down the first a Jebusite first. That's 1 Chronicles 11, verses 5 and 6. Joab was that man. And so for all of Joab's faults, and he does have many flaws, we'll see them as we go through the next several chapters. He was a good leader. He was a good military leader. Very successful in terms of battle strategy. He appoints Zadok and Ahimelech as co-high priests. This arrangement likely came about out of the chaos that followed Eli and his sons and their situation. Zadok kept the tabernacle at Gibeon. You'll find that in 1 Chronicles 16 and verse 39. And Abiathar was with the ark in Jerusalem. 1 Chronicles 16 and verse 37. Both these men were from the family of Aaron, so both of them were in the Levite tribe and family. Both of them were from Aaron's family specifically, which allowed them both to be high priests. This dual priesthood provided this emphatic contrast that would eventually just underscore the whole fulfillment of God's promise to remove Eli's descendants from the high priesthood. You can go back and read that back in 1 Samuel 2, 27 to 36, and 1 Samuel 3, verses 12 through 14. We read about Jehoshaphat, who is given the position of recorder. He's one of the king's representatives. And just a quote that one person wrote about him, it says, "It was his duty to furnish the king and his ministers with an account of all the important events that take place in the kingdom, and to keep a record of them, and also to register the royal acts and decrees." And so David appoints Jehoshaphat as this recorder. He appoints Seraiah as secretary or scribe. Again, here's something mentioned about this role, even though the sources from the early monarchy did not reveal much about the actual tasks of the sofer. This official was clearly not simply a scribe, but rather the head of the royal chancellery. And so very likely she was, the person was responsible for preparing official documents, preparing for and gathering of official documents. It's a man named Benaiah who was over the Cherethites, a certain class of soldiers in David's army. And so here is one of David's mighty men, one of his trusted men of valor and strength and courage, and he's placed over different groupings of soldiers, train and prepare for them. And then David's sons are appointed as chief ministers. They were given positions of honor, having immediate access to the king, and yet very likely they probably performed very little in terms of the official function of the kingdom. And we'll see this in a few chapters as Absalom comes into the light. Well, you stop and think about this. All these people that David places into these positions of leadership, people that he appoints to his cabinet to reign and to work with him. And it's a reminder to surround yourself with people who will help you succeed. To put your people, to surround yourself with a great team who will help you continue to grow and to do great things. You see this in the NBA, you see it in the NFL, that you want to get the right person for the right job, the right fit. So teamwork is crucial. Teamwork helps us learn to depend on the strengths of others. And when we learn to work as a team, we realize that it all doesn't hang on one person. So very often we feel like if we want to get the job done right, we have to do it ourselves. But the problem is when we try and do it all alone, we try and do everything by ourselves, we get burnout. We end up able to do far less than we would be able to do if we simply gathered the right people who are successful and gifted and talented in certain areas and employed those talents to help us. And I think that's something for us to think about. You think about Ephesians 4, verses 11 through 16, and how the purpose of the local leaders in the congregation, the local church, their purpose is to equip the saints for the work of service. It's just a way of reminding us that everyone has a role that we can fill. Everyone has a job that we can do. And rather than trying to do everything by ourselves, look at David, who surrounded himself with people who were gifted and talented, and he put those talents to use. He put them to work. And because he surrounded himself with people of character and integrity and excellence, the kingdom flourished. And so if we're engaged in a work, whether it be in a congregation or maybe there's projects that I'm trying to take on, things in my life, surround yourself with a great team. People who are trustworthy, people who have proved themselves to be excellent, and you will do far more when you employ teamwork, when you work with others, than you would be able to do by yourself when you work with excellent people. When you look at 2 Samuel chapter 10, 2 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 2, here's what the verse reads, 2 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 2. David said, "I will show kindness to Hanun, the son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me." So David sent some of his servants to console him concerning his father. But when David's servants came to the land of the Ammonites, the princes, and he was told the suspicious message. One of the things that's highlighted through here is that even though David had this battle mindset, a mindset of a warrior, he still was able to maintain and retain his heart of mercy. And so his instinct was not kill first. His instinct was not to murder, to just slaughter and slay. No, even though he was a great military leader, he still continued to have that heart of compassion and kindness. He honored what he had received. And so you notice the characteristics of the heart of the man after God's own heart. A heart that seeks justice, that loves mercy, and that walks humbly before his God. Well, 2 Samuel chapter 3 records one other thing that takes place during this time. So as David is expanding the kingdom, is strengthening the armies, is receiving all sorts of successes militarily through the strength of the Lord, it's also during this time that his family grows. So as the kingdom is growing and the nation is growing, his family is growing during this time. So 2 Samuel chapter 3 tells us that David has potentially 5 wives at Hebron and 6 children. And then 2 Samuel chapter 5 tells us that David took even more concubines and wives from Jerusalem and had more sons and more daughters. So David obviously had no problem with polygamy, having multiple children by those different women. And one of David's greatest failures, even though he was a great success in terms of military leadership, in terms of even as a king and what he was able to do for the nation, one of his greatest failures is in his role as a father, as a husband and a father. Could it be that David just became too busy to manage and to guide and to discipline his own children? I think when you go back to the book of Leviticus or Deuteronomy chapter 17, it's Deuteronomy chapter 17 and in verse 17, we see this verse played out in the life of David. Deuteronomy 17 and verse 17, spoken of the king, the future kings that would reign. It says that he shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. Well, don't you see that played out in the life of David? The numerous wives of David steal his heart from God. No, not in the same way that Solomon's did. Not after idols or gods or false gods. No, it seems that perhaps David's heart was stolen not by idolatry or false gods, but it was stolen by lust or power. And we'll see that in the story of Bathsheba. And so what really took over David's heart? It's just a good reminder here. No life's pursuit is more important than paying attention to our family. It's a hard lesson for up-and-coming families to learn. And the quest to get ahead of the curve, so very often it's easy to leave behind our mates and our children in that quest. It's not the commitment that gets us in trouble. It's overcommitment. Overcommitting ourselves. And so during the infancy years of marriage or the formative years of raising our children, our families can be pushed to the back burner as we try and achieve it all. Try and gain more money, to climb higher on the corporate ladder, and that's just a terrible mistake to make. Because misplaced priorities will eventually pay out in a terrible cost. It's a family that has no father is left to their own direction. So our families often deserve far better than what some are giving to them. They deserve our best rather than giving the leftovers. Discipline, instruction, building relationships, connections, trust, counseling, they just require something that you have to be willing to pay. 4-letter word. It all requires time. Your constant attention and time. The time and the energy and the emotional support given to them. And it's a good reminder, even though David was successful as a king, he was a failure as a father. It is completely possible today to be successful in some areas of our lives and yet to be a failure where it matters the most. Don't get distracted. Don't get distracted by the mere side quests that this world can take you upon. By the many opportunities that can be placed before you. Don't get so caught up in trying to climb the ladder of success, to try and achieve every dream that you may possibly have, that you forget what's most important in this life. If you're married, if you have kids, if you have grandkids, your highest priority is to care for the souls entrusted to you. Learn from David. Learn from the great things. He had his eyes focused on God, and he knew he could walk with courage because God was with him. And that's a great lesson. But also learn, don't get so busy, so caught up in trying to do everything, that you neglect the most important thing, and that's your family. Thank you so much for studying with me today. I hope this study has been encouraging for you. If you have any questions or thoughts or things that you've seen from this text, I'd love to hear from you and to see some things that you have learned from this study. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I look forward to having you back here with us again soon. Take care.